Newly rediscovered bones and artifacts are prompting a bold question. Were Homo sapiens burying their dead in Crimea 100,000 years ago, and are these sites mislabeled as Neanderthal? The Crimea has always been inconvenient since it was discovered by Soviet scientists in the 1920s. It sits where stories prefer not to look, between Europe and Asia, between forest and steppe, between the Mediterranean world and the northern plains. For most of the 20th century, it was treated as a peripheral zone, a place where Neanderthals lingered late or survived oddly, a cul-de-sac rather than a crossroads. But the archaeology and anatomy of Crimea refuse that role. They keep insisting, quietly but persistently, that this peninsula was not the edge of anything. It was a hinge. The problem begins with bodies. Crimean fossils have long been described as pre-classic Neanderthals or interglacial Neanderthals, a phrase that sounds precise but functions mostly as a holding pen. These individuals are often more gracile than the classic Neanderthals of Western Europe, with reduced facial projection, less extreme cranial architecture, and limb proportions that do not scream cold-adapted isolation. They appear during interglacial windows, when climate softened, corridors opened, and movement across Western Eurasia became not just possible, but likely. Other examples of interglacial or pre-classic Neanderthals include the Krapina Neanderthals of Croatia and the Apidema Neanderthal of Greece. To call these interglacial hominins of 100,000 years ago pre-Neanderthal is to assume the ending before reading the middle. It presumes that the story flows inevitably toward the later, colder, more robust later Neanderthals. But the evidence suggests something else, that these gracile Crimean populations were not on a one-way track toward Neanderthalization, but part of a broader Eurasian population system whose southern anchor lay in the Levant. The evidence leads to the question, were these sapiens or sapiens introgressed Neanderthals? To ask that question is heresy under the strict out-of-Africa story because no Homo sapiens are allowed to survive in Eurasia before 50,000 years. They were all failed migrations. They don't really matter. They don't need to be discussed. In this light, the Levant matters here because it is the one place where early Homo sapiens stand in full view. By roughly 130 to 80,000 years ago, people at School and Kafsa were burying their dead, using ochre, and living in mixed woodland environments that demanded flexibility rather than brute specialization. Their skeletons are not uniform. Some are robust, some gracile. Many sit uncomfortably between later textbook categories. What unites them is not a particular skull shape, but a behavioral profile, planning depth, symbolic action, and ecological breadth. These populations did not blink into existence and then vanish. They occupied a region that opens northward, and during interglacial phases, that opening widened. Crimea is exactly where you would expect those movements to leave a trace. It lies along the Black Sea corridor, a natural route linking Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Pontic steppe, and Eastern Europe. During warm periods, this corridor was not hostile. It was green, navigable, and productive. Large herbivores moved through it. Humans followed. The idea that Homo sapiens reached the Levant early but somehow stalled there, unable or unwilling to move north during favorable climates, is biologically implausible. The more reasonable assumption is that they did move, and that what we later label as pre-Neanderthals in regions like Crimea are part of the record of that movement. The burial at Kik Koba brings this into sharp focus. An adult individual was placed deliberately in a pit, limbs flexed, position controlled, with red ochre present in direct association. An infant was buried nearby as well. This is not casual disposal. It is not an accident of sedimentation. It is an intentional act that requires foresight, social meaning, and shared norms. This was not normal Neanderthal behavior 100,000 years ago. The ochre itself had to be sourced, transported, and applied. None of this happens in a cognitive vacuum. What makes Kik Koba unsettling is not that it resembles later Upper Paleolithic burials, but that it aligns so neatly in time and logic with the ochre-associated burials of the Levant around 100,000 years ago. two regions connected by geography showing the same behaviors during the same interglacial window. Neanderthals, on the other hand, were not known to bury their dead until around 60,000 years ago, as shown at Shanidar and other sites. The usual response is to insist on difference. The Levantine burials are Homo sapiens, the Crimean burial is Neanderthal. End of discussion. But that conclusion rests on the assumption that morphology maps cleanly onto population history, and that symbolic behavior must travel with a particular skull shape. Genetics has made that assumption untenable. Every Neanderthal genome sequenced so far carries traces of Homo sapiens ancestry acquired well before 50,000 years ago. Their mitochondrial DNA was replaced by a sapiens-derived lineage. Their Y chromosomes were replaced as well. This means that by the time of Kik Koba, there were no pristine Neanderthals anywhere in Eurasia. There were populations with varying proportions of ancestry, shaped by repeated contact over tens of thousands of years. Once that is acknowledged, the category pre-Neanderthal starts to look like a misdiagnosis. These Crimean individuals are better understood as interglacial Eurasian humans whose anatomy reflects a blend of ancestry and local adaptation, not a stage on a conveyor belt towards something else. Their gracility is not a sign of incompleteness. It is a clue. The tools reinforce this picture. Crimea sits squarely within the distribution of the Mikokian, a stone tool system defined not by expedience but by investment. Mikokian tools were designed to last. They were resharpened, maintained, and carried across landscapes. Raw materials moved over long distances. Forms were standardized across regions stretching from Western Europe to the Black Sea and beyond. This is not the archaeological footprint of tiny, isolated bands scraping by at the edge of extinction. It is the footprint of populations with territorial knowledge, social transmission, and long-term continuity. Labeling the Mikokian as a Neanderthal industry has always been more an act of classification than explanation. It assumes that because Neanderthal-looking skeletons are found at some sites, the technology must be Neanderthal in origin and nature. But this logic breaks down once the geographic and temporal spread of the Mikokian is taken seriously. The same tool logic appears across vastly different environments and persists for roughly 80,000 years. That kind of stability and reach is more consistent with a widespread population system than with a localized adaptation. Seen through the Crimean lens, the Mikokian begins to look less like a Western European invention and more like a Eurasian tradition whose roots lie in earlier Homo sapiens expansions. During interglacial periods, sapiens-leaning populations moved north out of the Levant, mixing with resident groups and spreading a behavioral logic centered on curated tools and planned mobility. In colder phases, these populations contracted, became more regionally distinct, and in some areas developed the classic robust Neanderthal morphology we recognize later. But the underlying behavioral system persisted. Crimea, again, is where this continuity is hardest to ignore. It is not merely a recipient of Western traditions, it is a place where Eastern and Western streams meet. During warm phases, populations could move east toward the Caucasus and the Altai, or west toward Central Europe. The presence of Mikokian-like industries far to the east, in regions associated with Denisovans and Eastern Neanderthals, makes little sense if the Mikokian is imagined as a parochial European Neanderthal tradition. It makes much more sense if it reflects a shared sapiens-grade behavioral package carried by interconnected populations across Eurasia. The idea that Europe was sparsely populated during these periods is often invoked to dismiss this model. Neanderthals, we are told, lived in tiny, fragmented groups, incapable of sustaining large-scale traditions. Europe, therefore, was effectively empty, waiting for a decisive African expansion. But this is an argument from convenience, not from evidence. The density of sites, the depth of sequences, and the sheer longevity of traditions like the Mikokian argue for populations that were neither tiny nor ephemeral. Cultural continuity over tens of thousands of years requires people, enough of them to transmit knowledge across generations and repopulate regions after climatic downturns. Crimea again undermines the minimization narrative. It shows repeated occupation, complex behavior, and early symbolic action. It sits in a region that would have been central, not marginal, to any movement between the Levant and Europe. To treat it as peripheral is to misread the map. What emerges from all this is a picture that is less tidy, but far more coherent. Homo sapiens did not arrive in Europe once, late and alone. They expanded out of Africa earlier, reached the Levant, and during favourable climates pushed into southeastern Europe and beyond. In places like Crimea, they encountered resident populations and mixed with them. The result was a spectrum of anatomies and a shared behavioural system that we later fracture into named cultures and species. The Mikokian is one expression of that system. The ochre burial at Kik Koba is another. Calling the Crimean fossils pre-Neanderthals obscures this reality. It implies a linear progression toward a type that only fully crystallises under later, harsher conditions. A better reading is that these interglacial, gracile Crimean humans represent a sapiens-leaning population adapted to Eurasian environments, carrying behaviours already present in the Levant and spreading them east and west along open corridors. Their descendants in colder phases look different, but their ancestry and capacities are continuous. In this light, Crimea stops being a footnote and becomes a fulcrum. It links Levantine Homo sapiens to European traditions without requiring miracles or mass replacements. It explains why symbolic behaviour appears early and widely. It explains why curated tool systems span continents. And it exposes how much of our evolutionary storytelling depends on shrinking populations on paper to keep continents conceptually empty. The past was not a series of isolated theatres waiting for innovation to arrive. It was a crowded, connected world. Crimea was one of its main stages. Crimea again sharpens the point. Positioned between the Caucasus, the steppe, and Eastern Europe, it is ideally placed to function as a long-term overlap region rather than a fleeting crossroads. The presence of gracile interglacial populations, curated Mikokian technologies, and symbolic burial behaviour, there is not what one would expect at the fringe of interaction. It is exactly what one would expect in a stable mixing zone, where populations met repeatedly over tens of thousands of years. Once this broader geography is acknowledged, the Levant's role shifts. It remains important, but it is no longer singular. It becomes the southern anchor of a much larger interaction belt that extended northward during warm periods and contracted southward during cold ones. Contact did not happen once and then resolve. It pulsed. Each interglacial reopened corridors, and each contraction reshaped populations that had already mixed. This perspective also resolves a long-standing asymmetry in how evidence is interpreted. When early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlap in the Levant, it is framed as foundational. When similar overlaps appear further north, they are framed as anomalies. The difference is not the data, it is the expectation. The Levant is allowed to be a meeting zone because it fits the story. Europe and its borderlands are not, because acknowledging them as such would erase the idea of a clean expansion frontier. But once the overlap zone is shifted northward, or more accurately, widened northward, the pieces align. The interglacial, gracile populations of Crimea no longer look like evolutionary preliminaries. They look like participants in the same process visible at School and Kafsa. The Mikokian no longer looks like a provincial Neanderthal adaptation. It looks like a sapiens-grade behavioral system expressed across a broad Eurasian landscape. In this expanded frame, the Levant is not dismissed. It is contextualized. It is one node in a network that extended from North Africa through the eastern Mediterranean and deep into Europe. The true overlap zone was not a point on a map. It was a region, stretching from the Balkans through Italy and Crimea, waxing and waning with climate, but persistent enough to leave a deep archaeological and biological imprint. The old story imagines Homo sapiens stepping onto a European stage after a brief rehearsal in the Levant. The emerging evidence suggests something more complex and more human, that the rehearsal, the performance, and the improvisation all happened together, across a wide and crowded landscape where boundaries were never as sharp as we later pretended. Thanks for watching.